We now have the pleasure of being joined by Georgia Tech play-by-play broadcaster and former Syracuse alum and WAER sports director Andy Demetra. Andy, thank you so much for joining me on the Ostrom Avenue podcast. Second time guest. How are you doing today?
Doing well. I'm happy to be invited back. Good that we can catch up.
Yeah, well, we were just talking about it before we started recording, but Syracuse and Georgia Tech played a crazy game last year inside the Dome. This season, a little different stakes, but I want to go back to last year's Georgia Tech program. Really strong start, obviously, out in Dublin, beating Florida State, and a 7-6 season. But how would you say last year's team or last year's season went? Even though the record was the same as 2023, but there were some more high quality wins on that schedule.
There were, and I think Georgia Tech fans will say there should have been one more regular season win, and it was the eight overtime game in Athens. And then played flat in the bowl game, which accounted for that 7-6 final record, albeit against what's turned out to be a very good Vanderbilt team. I think some of the issues that maybe flared up with Georgia Tech and its inconsistency week to week, they've addressed that, and that's the reason why they're now sitting at 7-0. But I think it was another marker in the ascent of this program under Brent Key, and you're seeing a more fully realized version of that this year. It's really no different, this Georgia Tech team, than last year, except they're deeper, but they still play with a lot of poise, a lot of maturity. And I think now in some of these close games that Georgia Tech had, where you have some second half inflection points that were able to meet the moment, and maybe had they not gone 7-6 last year and learning some of those hard lessons, they wouldn't be standing here at 7-0 and 3-0 in the ACC right now.
How do you think some of those big games, like the big win over Florida State, that really fun game to watch against Georgia, the win against Miami, did for the program building down at Georgia Tech?
Well, I think it kind of confirmed to the players and to the coaches that they have a team with the right mindset, that they don't get rattled. The moment doesn't get too big for them. And even in that matchup in Athens, you saw them go toe to toe with a team that had been on a long multi-year home win streak. And so I think some of those close games reinforce that they have the fortitude, the toughness, not only mentally, but physically to hold up in some of those tough, close, taut games. And, look, any team that it has high ambitions, you know that it's not going to be a breeze every single Saturday. You're going to have to weather some adversity and some ebbs and flows throughout a game, but it's how you respond to that that kind of defines how your career, how your season unfolds. And we're seeing Georgia Tech show that poise and that maturity all throughout this season. You saw flashes of it last year, but now you're seeing longer stretches of it, and it's starting to pay off for Georgia Tech.
Last year's schedule, obviously a gauntlet playing all those incredibly tough teams. This season, the schedule's been a little easier. Clemson, the only ranked team that Georgia Tech has played. Obviously, we know how Clemson's season is gone. But do you think that this year's schedule plays a factor into how well Georgia Tech has been? And obviously, the next four games aren't as tough as necessarily the top 25 teams, and then Georgia, the last game of the season. But how do you think this year's schedule has played into a factor of the team's success?
Well, to be perfectly candid, I think that's why expectations were high for Georgia Tech, because you could game out the schedule and see that it was on the more manageable side. They didn't face Louisville, they wouldn't face SMU, they wouldn't face Miami, they wouldn't face Florida State, even though that bloom is kind of off the rose in Tallahassee. But it is never easy to win on the road in the ACC, no matter the caliber of opponent. And Georgia Tech going on the road to begin the year versus Colorado and turn it over on their first three possessions, yet still come back and win the game in a very hostile environment in Boulder. Then to overcome a 17-point deficit at Wake Forest. And yeah, Wake Forest was very modestly thought of beginning this year, but there's a reason why not many teams can overcome a 17-point deficit on the road. It simply doesn't happen often, and Georgia Tech was able to kind of find its offense and figure out a way as that game unfolded. And then, let's not discount that Duke game last Saturday on the road. And Georgia Tech's at that point now where that target is growing ever bigger on their back, and they knew they'd be getting Duke's best shot. And Duke was also 3-0 in the ACC, and they'd been averaging 42.7 points across those three conference wins. So for Tech to hold them to just 18 points on their home field and score 17 unanswered in the fourth quarter and put that game away, that was another game that kind of certifies who Georgia Tech is and what they can become this year. So while, yeah, the schedule may avoid some of the other so-called heavy hitters of the league this year, at least those that were thought of in preseason. You still have to go and get the job done every Saturday, and Georgia Tech has done that.
Normally for Georgia Tech, it's been the offense giving them the spark, but you mentioned the defense against Duke, and that was kind of the big two red zone stops against the Blue Devils, including that 95-yard scoop and score. How has GT's defense been able to set the tone this year when that offense has been in need of a spark?
I think they're getting better week by week. They have a new defensive coordinator in Blake Gideon who came over from Texas. This is his first time as a defensive coordinator at the FBS level. And I think, as with any first year defensive coordinator, even though he came in highly recommended, sometimes it takes a while for you to find your play calling rhythm. What was encouraging for Georgia Tech in that Duke game was the way they shut down the run. If you look statistically, that is maybe a weakness of Georgia Tech, at least getting consistent stops on the ground, but they were able to really force Duke into becoming one-dimensional on offense and having to ride the arm of Darian Mensah. So I think that was very encouraging for Georgia Tech. They got those red zone stops. It was in many ways a textbook definition of bend but don't break versus Duke, but you still have to deliver in those moments, and the Georgia Tech defense did. I think they still have room to grow as far as getting takeaways. That count is not where it needs to be, and we know that Syracuse has struggled with coughing the ball up. And so Georgia Tech has not been a dominant takeaway forcing team this season, but yet they get off the field on third down. They do a pretty good job. And I think the other thing, too, is they really upgraded their quality depth on defense this offseason, not only on the line, but in the back four. And that's where you're seeing it start to pay off as this season has gone on.
You mentioned Syracuse's struggles offensively, and that certainly has been the case. What Pittsburgh did really well last week was just let Ricky Collins try to throw the ball and pressure the pressure of the offensive line, send a lot of guys, and just play for the run. Do you think that's something that Georgia Tech is going to be able to do? Just focus on the run, make sure Syracuse can't get the run game going, and just allow Ricky Collins to try to figure it out offensively?
Yeah, and I think it's easy to consider that the template for defending Ricky Collins moving forward. But at the same time, Syracuse is scheming up some plays that'll make him more comfortable, whether it's rolling him out of the pocket, giving him half field reads, and turning him loose in the running game. I think, you have to respect his athleticism and how dynamic he can be should he call his own number. Remember that Georgia Tech is playing without its top cover corner, Amari Harvey. He dislocated his ankle in that Virginia Tech win. Even though he should be back by the end of the regular season, they won't have him available on Saturday. And there were times where it felt like Duke was picking on some of those cornerbacks for Georgia Tech, though they did get a little tighter in their coverage as the second half unfolded. I think Georgia Tech also in that second half, Griffin did a good job of getting some pressure and forcing Mensah into some off-platform throws and moving his feet. I think that's probably their best course of action. Of course, I'm not in those defensive game planning meetings, but it seemed to work well against one of the more highly regarded passers in the ACC. And I think anytime you can cage the pocket against somebody like Ricky Collins, that might be your best course of action. But as you know, when you're dealing with 18 to 24-year-olds, redemption is always 1 week and 4 quarters away. And Georgia Tech is respectful enough of Ricky Collins. Brent Key had some very glowing comments about him in his press conference on Tuesday. They know what type of weapon he can be, and they can't make it easy on him. Because if so, he's on ACC scholarship like everybody else, and he certainly has the arm talent to be able to gather some confidence as the game goes on.
I was going to ask about Harvey, but good thing you already touched on that. Another guy that missed against Duke, Akello Stone, one of the top pass rushers, defensive tackle for Georgia Tech. Didn't play against Duke. Do you know if there's any injury update around him and if he's going to get going for Syracuse?
No, not certain on a kilo stone, but Georgia Tech, again, they have good depth, especially up the middle with Jordan Vandenberg, who was second team All ACC last year. Matthew Alexander is a transfer, a veteran from UCF. He's done nicely as well. And so, regardless of Stone's availability, I think Georgia Tech in a game and a half has shown that, they're not, there's not too much of a drop off right now between the tackles. And I think that's an encouraging thing.
All right. Now we get to talk about the fun stuff. The offense. Haynes King, Jamal Haynes, third season together at Georgia Tech. How have you seen them grow over the course of those 3 years and now into their final season here?
Yeah, I think this is the longest interview I've ever done before being asked the first question about Haynes King. So you set the record. That is admirable discipline and restraint on your part. But no, anytime you have a 3-year starting quarterback and a 3-year running back, it bodes well for your prospects entering the season. And Haynes King, I mean, it borders on tried at this point, but he really epitomizes the toughness of this Georgia Tech team. 10 rushing touchdowns, just somebody who's so skilled at manipulating the mesh. And it's so easy for teams to say, well, let's just take away Haynes King's running ability. But Georgia Tech has so many different formations and motions and counterplays. They continually find ways to keep defenses off balance. And whether Haynes King is pulling it and using his own legs or whether he's delivering it to Jamal Haynes, you have two guys who are very good in getting positive yards, but I will say this as well. It's not all on the legs of Jamal Haynes this year. Yeah, he's a two-time All-ACC back, but you look at Malachi Hosley, he actually is averaging slightly more yards per game than Jamal Haynes. So they're able to roll those guys in, keep them fresh. They have a lot of good complementary pieces in that backfield. And of course, you have to respect the running ability of Haynes King, on top of him being a very accurate passer, close to 70% completion percentage this year after he broke the ACC single season completion percentage record a year ago. So, yeah, between Haynes King and Jamal Haynes, or as we like to call them, the law office of Haynes and Haynes, that's a pretty good starting point and building block for Buster Faulkner's offense.
With the style of offense that GT likes to run, the wear and tear is always a concern. Injuries up front always a concern. How have the been players, whether it's Haynes King or Jamal Haynes, the offensive line been holding up so far this season?
You know what, Brent Key, and I'm sure he would say this while knocking on wood, they've been very good in avoiding any major injuries. But he also says the most important skill you can have right now at this time of the season is player availability. And there's a reason why they tried to get a lot of guys snaps early in the season, even in games like against Colorado and Clemson, because they knew that they would need those guys should injuries kind of throw a wrench into their personnel groupings or their depth chart at this time of the year. And so Georgia Tech is, I think, and anytime you're number 7 in the nation, you have to have some good fortune from an injury standpoint. And Georgia Tech has benefited from that. But they're also able to weather some of those injuries because of their commitment to depth and playing guys so that the lights aren't going to be too bright for them if they do have to come in because of a battlefield promotion due to injuries. So they've been very good when it comes to staying healthy as a team can be at this time of the year, but also they were very deliberate in making sure they got guys experience that they could bank should they need them for later on in the year.
Haynes, Brent Key, rather, is one of the more fun coaches, in my opinion, to watch. And what do you think it says about him and his style of coaching that he's been able to keep the law office of Haynes and Haynes at Georgia Tech? And, the world of college football right now, you never know what loyalties lie where and the transfer portal and everything. But them staying at Georgia Tech for another year, what does that say about Brent Key?
Well, I think it not only says about Brent Key, but about this institute as a whole, that there is a lot of alignment. And Georgia Tech has done a very good job on an administrative level of committing money, whether it's through NIL or coaches' salaries or through facilities, to make sure that they can retain their roster. I think, whenever you experience success, teams are always going to catch a wandering eye towards your talent. And Georgia Tech was not immune from that this offseason. They lost their top receiver, Eric Singleton, who was arguably one of the most sought after wide receivers in the portal. But Georgia Tech also went out and got a guy like Eric Rivers, who was an AP third team All American at FIU. And, they're addressing their own needs in the transfer portal. And, whether it's with a Haynes King or a Jamal Haynes or some of the returning guys, they've shown that they're willing to commit the resources to have continuity, which I think accounts for so much of a team's success in this day and age. And certainly for a program like Georgia Tech, I think that's such an underappreciated element of how this team has gotten to 7-0 is you just look at their continuity. That they were able to retain a lot of their talent, particularly at skill positions, so that they could continue their rise in 2025. So it not only says that about Brent Key and the loyalty he's kind of engendered with his players, but also just what this athletic department has done as a whole to make sure that they're going to be competitive in all phases of a program in college football 2025.
Brent Key, a Georgia Tech alum. I would be remiss if I didn't ask about the crazy coaching carousel. It's going to happen, this off season and towards the end of the season. Do you think there's anything that Georgia Tech can do, or do you think there is strong commitment from Brent Key to keep him in Atlanta?
Well, you remember he went to Georgia Tech. He began his career as a GA at Georgia Tech. And for fact, this was his 25th season of coaching. His very first game as a college coach was as a graduate assistant, 2001. Georgia Tech opened that season versus Syracuse in the kickoff classic at Giant Stadium. But that's uh, apropos of nothing. No, look, I think, and Brent has kind of alluded to this, that, whenever you have success, with that comes attention, it comes exposure, and that's great. Georgia Tech, whether it's Brent Key or his individual players, they have all earned that. But I think the one reason why Brent Key connects with this fan base so much is that he is Georgia Tech through and through. And that's just not 2025 Brent Key talking when he's got the number seven ranked team in the nation. This was the Brent Key who talked when he took over as interim head coach in 2022 and in 2023 when they finally earned bowl eligibility for the first time in 5 years. He has a lot of loyalty toward this place, and I think that counts for a lot. Of course, nobody can peer into a crystal ball as far as the spins of the coaching carousel, but I think Georgia Tech fans feel somewhat confident that they have a guy who believes in what this institute stands for and loves being here, loves knowing that he has his alma mater at heights that they haven't reached in the better part of 2 decades. And I'm sure Brent Key will be sought after like any coach is in this day and age, but I think there's a lot of loyalty in the bank with Brent Key and Georgia Tech.
Well, hopefully for Georgia Tech, that is the case. And, the highest ranking in 11 years, highest ranking in the regular season in 16 years, number seven in the country, big deal down in Atlanta. What do you expect to get from this game against Syracuse and against a team that, it's beaten some good teams, lost its quarterback? What do you expect Georgia Tech to take from this game?
Well, they have to stick to their identity, and you got to tip your cap to Syracuse. 7 sacks, 13 TFLs really jumps off the page, and what they did versus Pitt to neutralize their running game. Georgia Tech's identity will always be through the run, and so I don't think that they will necessarily stray from that. But you have to make sure that you're staying on schedule, that you're converting third downs. Can they make Ricky Collins uncomfortable? Can they prevent some of those explosive plays that can deliver a lot of confidence to a quarterback who might be feeling a little shaky? But again, redemption is always just one game away, and there's enough skill talent. Brent Key had a lot of compliments to give to Willis and to Nixon and that Syracuse running game. And they have to make sure that they can contain that aspect of Syracuse's offense. They have to make sure that they don't gift wrap short fields through turnovers to Syracuse. It's interesting that Georgia Tech, for as awful as they were in giving up the football their first 2 games, 5 turnovers through their first 2 games, they've only turned it over once since. And so they have to make sure that they value the football. They have to win the special teams game. They've done a really good job of that this year, and just prevent Ricky Collins from getting into a rhythm where he gathers confidence as the game goes on. And oftentimes when you're flying high like this, it's about how you can manage the expectations and not be out of character, not let that success seduce you into straying from who you were those first 7 games of the year. So, for Georgia Tech, to their credit, they've been very businesslike and have had a very businesslike, workmanlike approach through this 7-0 start. It hasn't always resulted in the flashiest of scores, but they get the result they had been seeking at the beginning of the day. So that's kind of Georgia Tech's approach, no different than how it's been the first 7 weeks of the season. And they know that they will, like usual, get Syracuse's best shot.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time, as always. Really appreciate having you on. Enjoy the game Saturday.
I appreciate that, Griffin. Thank you.